Hey, listen. No, really. Listen. Man, I love this title theme. I could sit here and just let this track play forever. Brings me back to simpler times. Times where I was roughly the same age as young Link. A few years older, perhaps. But still, I'd count that as roughly. Never really owned a copy of this game as a kid, but I remember playing it everywhere. My friends had copies, some of my family members had copies. I was surrounded by this game, no matter where I went, except at home. I was too young at the time to really focus on gaming news, not that really a whole bunch was popping off back then, but you'd get little tidbits here and there. Copies of Nintendo Power, I had some of them, and I'd get new ones every once in a while. And while it was very Nintendo-centric, I'd pick up a few new things from every issue. I was mostly a Nintendo kid growing up. I had played Sega and PlayStation, but those were only really ever the exception. I would eventually get my hands on those consoles and lose them almost as quickly. Nintendo, though, I don't know, for some reason that just kind of stuck around. I think my very first meant-for-me console was the N64. I played on the older systems for sure, but those belonged to others in my family. No, the N64 was mine, or at least half mine. My younger brother played on that as well, but it wasn't my dad's or my uncle's, not even my aunt's. It was mine. And oh man, what a console to have. So many fun and interesting games had come out. They weren't all great. In all honesty, looking back at the thing, it's a small miracle that it worked as well as it did on a technical level, but again, I was too young at the time for that. I was growing up, however. I was starting to notice more things happening around me. My eyes began to open to more than just what was directly going on in front of me. Now, I won't lie, I wasn't all of a sudden a wise old sage who had the infinite knowledge of the universe crammed into my tiny little skull. No, I was just beginning to ask questions, you know? I was beginning to look at things on a deeper level, or, at least as deep as a roughly 10-year-old kid could. I wanted to get more out of things. Mario 64 being a sort of measuring stick for how my tastes had started to change. It was fun. I could spend hours just flipping around and getting accustomed to how 3D games, well, more or less, worked, especially back then. 2D was just a way of life, and then to suddenly have a whole new dimension tossed in? Man, it blew my mind as a kid. I know PlayStation had been out and 3D was technically a thing already, but hey, listen, everybody starts somewhere, and my journey into 3D began with the N64. I found myself getting, not bored per se, but wanting something more out of the experience than this title screen. I knew this was something special. I never saw any ads for this, but it found its way to me. Honestly, I think I owned Super Smash Bros. Before actually getting my hands on an Ocarina of Time cartridge. What's more interesting is that this game was my first proper introduction to the series. I played a bit of Link to the Past, but I wouldn't grow a fondness for that game until much later. Plus, like I mentioned before, those games belonged to others, not me. Ocarina was something that I just needed to play. It was always dancing just outside of my reach, getting teases of it from friends and family when I would visit them. Then, one day, I got my own copy. I don't remember the exact circumstance of how it got to me. It might have been a birthday gift, it might have been a Christmas gift. Hell, it might have just been a gift for getting a great report card back in the day. Though, that was a rare occurrence. Not because I wasn't an academic or anything, just, money can be tight, so a gift like that was rare. Point is, I don't really remember. What I do remember, though, is booting it up and playing my very own file on my own game. I could go slow. I had time to just envelop myself in this game, explore everywhere, see everything the polygonal realm of Hyrule had to offer. And it all started with this title screen. I didn't know how this game ended. I barely knew how it started. I was both prepared and unprepared for what this game would ask of me. I wasn't really ready to bear the weight of what this game's story was and what it eventually led into. This game is foundational to me, and to the series overall. It would forever change me. It would leave a mark on the world of gaming that's still being felt to this day. Hey there, everyone. My name is Leon, and this is a story that, for better or worse, helped me grow up. Now, I'm gonna break away from almost every other video on this channel. As much as I would love to delve deep into the production history of this game, that's been done like a billion times over. There's nothing new that I can dig up or add to, really. If you wanted a breakdown of this game, I'm sure there are at least 1,000 others that have already been done to a near dissertation level. If that's something you're looking for, then I'm sure almost any other Zelda YouTube personality can get you that fix. This is going to be more about my experience with the game and how I remember it as a kid versus how I view it now as an adult. It has been way too long since the last time I booted this game up, and a lot has changed since my last playthrough. I've changed. My preferences have changed. Games have become infinitely more complex on mechanical levels. Controllers have gotten better. Seriously, what the hell was this? Hell, it would take forever, but Zelda also has undergone some changes. Barring the tone shift and story being explored in Majora's Mask, that game is quite literally an asset flip. It's a great game, don't get me wrong, and I'll be getting into that one later, but really the first game to shake things up even a little bit was Wind Waker, and that was mostly just because of the art style change, if that bothered you back then. And, well, I guess technically the seafaring exploration. Really though, the first game to change Zelda almost completely was Breath of the Wild. Almost every other Zelda leading into that one was iterative, and all that iteration was based off of Ocarina of Time. It's a great game to take the bones of, but there's a reason that the Zelda formula was, well, it was called the Zelda formula, and I'll be touching on this idea a little bit later. For all of its faults, the Zelda formula does work, usually. The late 90s and early 2000s were a strange and somewhat painful time in terms of 3D games. They went from looking like this to looking more like this, and that was just one generational jump. You could argue that a handful of titles were the foundation of this shift, and a few of them were Nintendo. Both Mario and Zelda, obviously. I would make an argument that were it not for these two games, the advent of precise control in a 3D space might have taken just a bit longer to reach, though that's just my take on it. Other titles around this time were also pushing directional movement in 3D space, but the precision was often kinda lacking. Along with that came the need to control cameras and, should the title call for it, a way to engage in combat. Now, as a kid growing up with these games, combat was just a single button press, usually. Either you jump or you swing. Some games had you use the face buttons for certain attacks, think Street Fighter or really any side-scrolling beat-em-up, but because it was all in a 2D surface, it was fairly easy to navigate. When 3D started out, there really wasn't a good way to solve this problem. Suddenly, people had to navigate depth. This problem definitely popped up in Mario 64. Mario's strange punches and grabs didn't really work all that well. I know personally playing these games at first had quite the learning curve. Zelda here, however, had a solution for that problem. They introduced Z-targeting. We know that pretty well today. It's more commonly known as like a sort of enemy lock-on mechanic. You can find it in just about any game that has a weapon-based fighting system. Possibly the best and most recent game to use such a feature is perhaps Elden Ring, though, much like Ocarina, it still had some room for improvement, albeit much less at this point. Z-targeting was such a solid idea. Not only did it help bring into focus more mechanically deep combat, but it did so without breaking a kid's brain at the time. The camera would lock onto the creature, and then it would kind of follow a sort of tracking shot, and it would sway back and forth. It usually tried to keep the angle at such a position that you could both see Link and whatever foe he was fighting, so you can sort of visibly feel the depth. It wasn't perfect. The camera can and did freak out every now and again. Plus the lock-on was a hard lock-on. As a kid, I didn't really notice because it was so new at the time. The fact that it did anything at all was impressive. On my revisit though, you can feel the age of this implementation. Even playing on the ship of Harkinian didn't really alleviate the lock-on troubles. It allowed for more precise camera control, which is excellent, but it was still kind of tough to navigate. The lock-on isn't very snappy, and trying to unlock off of things can be a little sloppy. It does make for some very cinematic fights, though. These were always so fun as a kid. Lock on and watch as you fight for positioning. Watch, of course, being the operative word here. To quote one Aaron Hansen,
"There is so much goddamn waiting."
Now again, no fault on the developers. As a kid, I was way too engrossed in playing the game and just being blown away. I either didn't care much, or I just didn't notice, and honestly, it was probably both. But I think the intention was to have it be slow and have it more reactive on the player's behalf, as opposed to being an active element to the player. You gotta keep in mind, this game was new to millions of people at the time. So, slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. Nowadays, maybe not so much. We're super accustomed to the style of game, and as such, the speed and pace can be ramped up. This is exactly the thing that makes Bloodborne or even Elden Ring so good. You can control the pace of the combat. This is that, but with some big ol' fat training wheels on it. So naturally, this game's gonna be just slower. Every attack is so heavily telegraphed that getting hit was surely your fault. I knew it as a kid, and even now. Though, if I'm honest, my impatience got me into more trouble than I'd like to admit on this revisit. Items. So many items, each having their own use. Some more fun than others. The more important ones require you to pay attention to where you were aiming. Seriously, there were really no targeting reticles here. You just kind of aimed an arrow or the slingshot and had to use a bit of the old Kentucky windage to figure out where to aim these things. The hook shot being the only exception. I can see why they did this, in a way, right? Like, if you just picked up a bow like the one that Link uses and loosed an arrow or two, you wouldn't really have any kind of apparatus to aim with. You just kind of had to figure it out. Great for immersion, but maybe not so much for the player experience. I didn't care, though. Back then, I would spend time getting better with the bow by going to the archery ranges in Hyrule. Whether on the ground or on horseback, I figured out how to make it work. There were rewards for all of this as well. Shooting well would net bigger quivers and seed satchels. and man, talk about a prize. Little things like this kept me coming back because eventually I would net the top score and earn those upgrades. And let's not forget about the sounds here. I know some of the music tracks are short and somewhat repetitive, but man, what a sound it was. Not every track was gold. I could maybe go without the Goron City theme, but there were so many more fun tracks to listen to. From the heroic Hyrule Field theme to the dark, musty sound of the dungeons, everything had a purpose. They were cooking back then in this regard. They had faith in their ability to make music that would last. I can't tell you how many of these songs I've heard in remixes or even as fun little Easter eggs in other titles. Hell, some professional musicians have used these songs and sound bites as samples in their work. I loved these songs as a kid, and I love them today as an adult. Like I said at the top of the video, I could listen to that title theme all day and just not get tired of it in the slightest. Hey, on the topic of music, while we're here, I can point to one game and show you a graph of ocarina adoption rates. Never before had I seen so many people talk about this instrument. Hell, before this, the only instrument I had any experience with, personally, was a recorder. You remember those? Why? Why were they everywhere back then? Is that still a thing, or have we moved past that? Sorry, getting a bit sidetracked here. Yeah, this strange oval suddenly started popping up all over the place. I'm convinced that the only reason they are still prevalent today is because of this game. I'm sure many people have a deep affection for the instrument, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't want one as a kid. Oh, who am I kidding? I'd totally get one today if I could. But oh man, if you were in this scene back then you knew somebody with one of these. I know that personally. It was all but a guarantee, really. There was so much to explore. The Kokiri Woods, Death Mountain, Lake Hylia, the Gerudo Desert, not to mention all the dungeons and even some places that seemed like they wouldn't have anything in them. I mean, I remember getting to Kakariko and finding out how to get into that well. There's a whole mini dungeon under the town. I couldn't believe it. I also couldn't leave it. Yeah, my first time down there was almost a one-way trip. I desperately needed that lens of truth to make heads or tails out of that place. It was wild. What was also wild were some of the monsters you could encounter. I know things like Gibdos existed in the earlier games, and to be honest, their implementation here is, lacking. It's just a standard mummy kind of enemy. Moreover, they're just reskins of Redeads. Oh, what are Redeads? Terrifying. That's what. They left such an impression on me that I didn't take any chances with them in this run. It was on sight with these guys. But also this thing, Deadhead? Hey, what is this? Dead Hand. This thing. Yikes, man. Even now it's unsettling. Back when I was a kid, though, forget it. Hands just grab you as it slowly wiggles at you and then takes that nice chunk out of you. Brutal. Even some things that were meant to be, what's the right way of saying this? Pleasant to look at? Yeah, that works. We're a bit uncanny. The Great Fairies are... am I even able to show this? As a kid, the screech they made as they appear was awful. I understand what they were going for now as an adult, but as a kid... I don't know, man. These fairies were about as scary as anything else. Now, though, look, I get it. Many female creatures of myth were depicted in similar fashions, so I get it. I'm just surprised that they were able to get away with this back then. Let's move on before things get a little too hot to handle. Yeah. One thing that stuck out to me on this replay, and really, as I've been going through the series as a whole, is that certain races just kind of popped up here. Gorons, Zoras, the Kokiri, and the Gerudo, and the Sheikah. It's weird, right? Like, I don't know about you, but when I think about Zelda games, the extra races they just kind of have always been here, but that's not the case. Most of them got added in here. Now, technically, the Zora have been around since Game 1, but Ocarina of Time deemed it necessary to add a distinction between River Zora, which are absent here for some reason, and Lake Zora. Lake Zora look more like fish people, and later installments would expand on the design of them to accommodate more fishiness, I guess. Overall, the design on them here is cool. Pretty good for an initial take on fish people. The Gorons are also pretty neat. Large, boulder-like creatures. They also have a decent design. Though, honestly, they wouldn't get much more diversity in later titles. Gorons just kinda look like Gorons, you know? The Gerudo are an interesting bunch of people. They take inspiration from Amazonian myth, so, think Wonder Woman and her whole group of people. No men allowed. Unless you're born in, and boy does that cause some trouble. Add in a little spice from various Middle Eastern cultures, or, at least an attempt at that, and you have the Gerudo. Overall, it's a pretty cool idea. They would also get more fleshed out as the series moved forward. Lastly, we got the Kokiri and the Sheikah. The Sheikah really don't get fleshed out until way later in the canonized lore here. Really, you only see Impa and Sheik, but not exactly a whole lot to pull from here outside of them just being some kind of weird, European ninja, I guess. Like I said, they get more fleshed out later, thankfully. The Kokiri, on the other hand, really only exist in this game. They get introduced here as small elf-like children of the forest, and their whole shtick is bizarre. They get little fairy companions, although that also kind of fades away after this game, and there's just a bunch of sad and terrifying lore that surrounds them. All of this is super fun to dive into now. As a kid, I didn't really care all that much. I just kind of did what the game asked of me, but I took time over the course of a few years to really get into the story. I doubt I got as much out of it then as I do now, but I'd like to think I was having fun. Oh, and if you're wondering what happened to the Kokiri in later installments, well... more on that in another video. You can get a horse. Everyone loves Epona. You can use hook shots, magic spells, fairies, and bottles. There's so much to this game, and it set a standard for basically everything else. It's nuts. If ever there was a title that expanded on what a game idea could be, it would be this game. Like many other titles that would transition into the third dimension, there were certainly growing pains, but some just kind of stood above the others and made that change with relative ease. There's a reason that a lot of people cite Bubsy 3D as technically advanced, So here's the thing. This game definitely set a precedent. You could make the argument that Link to the Past was really the beginning of this, but I do think that the N64, barring a few titles, was the generation built on iteration and refinement. The dev crew took Link to the Past and said, yeah, but what if 3D though? And that was kind of the whole idea. To their credit, it worked, and it worked really well. Maybe too well, if you ask me. What Link to the Past created was something that Ocarina nearly perfected. Every Zelda that came out after this one had a set structure to it. Some, maybe a bit less than others. Majora's Mask was just different enough in some aspects that you could argue that it was its own thing outside of the formula, but it still has its roots firmly planted in Ocarina. What do I mean by this? Well, I'll start off by giving you the gist. Link gets called to action. He goes and starts his trial. Link collects a set number of little doodads, in this case the spiritual stones. In Link to the Past it was the medals. You get the Master Sword, you get whisked away to another world and or time at some point. You collect medallions and sages. In Ocarina it was technically both. And once every dungeon is done, you face off against the big bad. Honestly, there's nothing wrong with it. It follows the hero's journey and storytelling almost to a T. But eventually, once you've done this enough times, people start to get a stale feeling from games. It's why titles like Resident Evil lost steam back in the day. People got tired of the saniness of all the titles. No hate here. I personally could play Resident Evil and almost any Zelda game at a moment's notice. But yeah, things were starting to become maybe a bit too formulaic. But if it's not broken, why fix it? The most recent Zelda titles that occupy the 3D space, Breath and Tears, are solid examples of something new and something that's roughly the same thing, but with a newer coat of paint on it. For as fun as Tears can be, Breath will, in my eyes anyway, always be the better title. Those games have a newish formula to them, but ultimately it boils down to the same ideas. The Zelda formula is both the series' greatest strength and its most brutal weakness. Had Ocarina of Time not been the game it was on release, were it just another game and not Zelda, things might be different today in terms of third-person action RPGs. Like, could you imagine if Quest 64 was the standard? Things would be wild. I will say, I am glad that Nintendo started taking chances eventually. I mean, it took almost 20-ish years, but hey, better late than never, right? There's nothing wrong with sticking to a formula. The hell, Echoes of Wisdom is proof that these games still work. But man, if ever there was a game that set a hard standard in this space, it's Ocarina of Time, hands down. Alright, let's check in real quick. Everybody good? Good to go? Y'all feeling okay? You tired of me yet? I would hope not. We're just getting started. If you got this far, take a second to do some YouTube stuff, yeah? Subscribe, like, all that jazz. Alright, take a sec, get a sip of water or something. We're gonna be jumping into the thick of it. Hey, listen. I'm gonna start getting into the story of this game. I'll be talking about it in decent detail and tossing in my experience alongside it. So, if you want to skip out on this for spoiler reasons, go ahead and use the description down there to jump ahead to the final thoughts or something. Yeah? Okay, let's go. So right off the bat, this game opens up with something being shown to us. A boy, a horse, a little girl, and a guy clad in black. As a kid, I thought this was cool. Even now, it's a decent hook. It leaves you asking what all of this even is. Why focus on the boy? What was the deal with the horseback escape in the rain? And who's this guy? For fans of the series, I bet you could figure out most of this on your first playthrough booting up. For someone like myself, however, it was certainly something. I knew who Link was because of the other games and, of course, Smash Brothers, but I didn't really have a frame of reference for Zelda, much less Impa, and while obviously the guy in black was a bad guy, see the ominous lightning strike for added flair, I had no idea who Ganondorf was. This guy could have been named anything, and I wouldn't have known what he was supposed to be. This guy, yeah, that's Jorvis. Up to this point in the series, the main villain was a giant pigman. This dude? I mean, he's got a look about him, but that ain't no pigman. So my mind was racing, trying to piece together this in the time that this cinematic plays out in. It cuts to the ever-faithful Navi getting her marching orders from the Deku Tree. There's lots getting tossed at us real quick here, though most of it is easy enough to follow. Nothing is so off the wall in terms of a fantasy setting that it becomes unfollowable, which is good because my 10-year-old self was locked in here. So, here comes the tutorial. Well, sort of. Lots of information being spat at you from a bunch of little kids. I mean, you gotta tell people how to handle this thing. This controller is wild. But yeah, you learn all the basics here. Z-targeting, movement, sick flips, and rolls. How to use Navi to talk with people from a distance, or, as we learn later on, from horseback. You can even find some money in small chests, pots, rocks, and grass. Once you feel accustomed to the controls, you can head to see the Deku Tree, but this guy, Mido? I don't know. This guy decides that it doesn't matter that the leader of the Kokiri asked for you. He places on some stipulations. You gotta get a sword and a shield. If you explored enough, though, you might have found the shield in the shop, and, well, the sword, you're gonna have to hunt that down. Just another way to get you to experiment in a safe-ish area. On a side note, what is causing these rocks to just roll around? You can hit them and cause them to come to a complete stop, but then for some reason they just keep on rolling? Must be forest magic or something. Once you get equipped, you can finally see the Deku Tree. More information gets explained to you. Yeah, get used to this. The game likes to front load a lot of things, such as the Deku Tree was cursed, and you have to save him by defeating the evil within. So, okay, cool, the first dungeon. And as far as firsts go, it's alright. Not too hard, some really basic monsters to deal with. All in all, it's a great tutorial to how the rest of this game is going to flow. It even ends with a fight against Goma. Now, as a kid, I had no idea what a Goma was, but I thought this was a cool monster design. The visual language used practically screams at you to hit the glowy eye. If you utilize Navi at all during any fight, it should give you some information on how to best deal with what it is you're facing down. Sort of like a live Pokedex or, bestiary in case things get a bit too hard for your small child brain to understand. That said, I know it's been done to death, but oh man, does Navi just kinda get to be a bit much. As a kid, I didn't care, really, because it was just a reminder of the valuable information that she had for you. As an adult, though, I could do without it. One dungeon boss down, and a slingshot later, and we get some more backstory about Hyrule. The Deku Tree tells you the foundational myth of how Hyrule came to be. 3 golden goddesses, Din, goddess of power, Nehru, goddess of wisdom, and Farore, goddess of courage. They formed the land, the laws of the world, and the nature that would live on the land and utilize those laws. Just as quickly as they arrived, they left, leaving the Triforce at their point of exit. A reminder to the world of their power. As far as creation myths go, this one's pretty good, and it explains the Triforce, and whether they planned for it or not, it gave further context to the prior games that also had the Triforce as a plot point. Along with this explanation comes the revelation that Link is not a Kokiri, like he and most of everyone else in the woods thought. Link is actually a Hylian. His mother ran from Hyrule Castletown on horseback. Lots of horseback escaping from that place, due to some sort of civil war that was tearing the countryside apart. Not a whole lot more gets explained here, other than Link's mother died in the woods after requesting that the Deku Tree take Link in. And if you know what happens to people who die in the woods, then, well, yeah, if you know it, you know. Turns out Link has always been destined to leave the woods, and were it not for the sudden shift taking hold, then Link might have left after it became very clear he was, taller than everyone else. With this call to action springing him forward down a path he was always meant to walk, leaving the woods you get an awkward goodbye from Saria, and a new item, an ocarina. Not the ocarina, but, an ocarina. Jeez, can I say that word anymore? Ocarina. The world opens up to you, and you enter the fields after getting text-locked by this owl. Seriously, why does the answer default to "please explain again"? I guess to make sure you actually pay attention to what they're trying to tell you. I think we all just kind of mashed through all that text on the first playthrough and accidentally cycled through it again, and even if you didn't mash through it, you still hit explain again. It's happened to you. You can't lie to me here. The game does open up somewhat. You can explore around and see what exists in the fields, but there really isn't a whole lot currently. Back then, this was cool as hell. You're telling me that I can just run around? I can go anywhere, see anything? This is something that most Zelda games allowed for? Sure. I mean, you could go just about anywhere and do almost anything, but you would quickly find the limits of that exploration. Certain items or events would need to happen first before you could really just do anything here. Still, seeing everything realized in 3D for the first time was really something special. That said, the game all but forces you to just head straight towards Hyrule Castletown. So, naturally, you'll head there, and then, in the meanest joke possible, the castle gates close right as you get close to it. The game has a very rudimentary day and night system, and it doesn't really do all that much unless you're super into item collecting and or looking for very specific NPCs. When nighttime happens, the castle gates close and you just kind of have to wait it out. Oh, but don't you worry, you won't be bored or nothing. A bunch of these stalled children start spawning, forcing you to either run around or, fight all night. Those castle guards really just sat up there in a tower and watched this 10-year-old kid fight for his life non-stop, all night. Once you get into town, though, there's a bunch of different things that can happen. Talking with this girl clues you in on where you might need to go. Getting to the castle proper is interesting. Got some stealth mechanics to deal with. And it's very bare bones. One wake-up call later, and you can break into the castle, and guess what? More stealth. It's a sneaking mission. Eventually, you'll get to talk with Zelda and get some more exposition. This was all neat back then. I hadn't really experienced a whole lot of what this game was asking me to do, and to some degree, it made sense to me then, and still does now, but it hasn't really aged all that well. So much gets told to you so quickly. This scene in particular would get a callback later, and you know the one. It was really something that showed just how far a person would go for the power that they want, a lesson that has stuck with me over the years for sure. You learn a song, you learn about Ganondorf, oh that's what his name is, and you'll get a letter that allows you to get into Death Mountain. So, off to Kakariko Village. There is a metric ton of things to do here, and it's all mostly worth it. You know, heart pieces and the like. And everyone's favorite hobby, grave digging and grave desecration. Maybe some song learning too. You know, everything that a child does in their spare time. Showing the letter to the gate guard lets you in, and then you get to meet with some Gorons. The most important one, of course, being Darunia. After getting him to dance like he's never danced before, oh man, what a interesting scene that was. He'll task you with opening up and clearing out the Dodongo Cavern. There's a lot of, let's say, inconsistencies with this task. Mainly that Gorons are a mining people who eat rocks. So, like, they could just eat their way into the cavern, but, you know, whatever. I liked the Gorons as a kid. They seemed goofy and maybe a bit dumb, but in like a cute way. You know, like a dopey small dog or something. This dungeon was a bit of a step up for me. It introduces a way to lose your shield. It is made of wood after all, and even the gate guard says you might want a more, you know, non-flammable one. You get some bombs, and after speaking with Darunia, and after his sweet rave party, a power bracelet lets you grab bomb flowers. So, you know, cool. That's the item, and you get to fight a giant lizard thing. Very nice. Returning to Darunia, you get the ruby stone, 2 down, and 1 more to go. The Zora domain is the next stop, and here you're gonna have to interact with just about all of the Zora. Eventually, you'll earn a scale for a diving minigame, which allows you to exit to Lake Hylia. This area was blocked off to you prior, you know, because of some fences. Here, if you dive deep enough, you'll find a bottle with a message in it. Looks like the Zora princess is hunting something down. You take it back to the king and, you know, narc on her. Narc! He lets you into the sealed area behind him, and this is where all the water comes from that the king was just kinda sitting in. Yeah, boy, I hope that water is nice and clean. Having a fish caught in a bottle and feeding it to Jabu Jabu here gets you inside this giant fish. And this level is just gross. First of all, what's the anatomy of this fish? Why are there floating platforms? Some of them even have spikes. What is this fish consuming? It was cool as a kid because I didn't really ask these questions. Sure, I was a little off-put by being inside a giant fish, but I was just kind of letting the story do what it wanted, and I was along for the ride. Conceptually, it's a neat idea, but man, this guy is way bigger on the inside, and the structure just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, eventually you'll find Ruto, and immediately you'll be on the receiving end of her, personality. She comes off very Asuka, very, as I know it now, tsundere, meaning she's mean and very kinda antagonistic towards you at first. You can't leave her alone though, you're gonna need her help with certain switches and other things. If you do leave her behind for any reason, even if it's the correct solution to a problem, she's gonna give you an earful for it. Thankfully, this doesn't really persist for very long, and once you get the boomerang, the dungeon wraps itself up quickly enough. That's all 3 stones, and at least one more marriage proposal. Time to head back to Hyrule Castletown. On the way there, we get to see this whole encounter. You know, the one that kicked off the whole game. You'll finally get the whole experience. It was cool to see this happen in real time. It really made you feel like you were part of, I don't know, a prophecy, I guess. It all played out just like the dream sequence said it would. Link even got a few going away presents, though honestly the ocarina was the only one worth keeping. So, man, the Castletown must be devastated because of this sudden betrayal from Ganondorf. I wonder what the people are. It's the same. Nothing's changed. This guy supposedly ransacked the castle, tried to kidnap the princess, and maybe killed the king? We don't really know. It never really got expanded on. The town gate guard is still just here, hanging out. All that buildup and then just, business as usual, huh? Okay. I will say, there is one guard that just straight up dies in front of you, but you kind of gotta go looking in an alleyway for that. Otherwise, no one really does anything in response to what happened like moments ago. Now, I wasn't a super genius or nothing as a kid, but I knew there was a strange disconnect going on here. All that stuff just happened, and no one seems to care. It just felt off. I wonder if the devs thought about this at all. My guess is it wouldn't make much sense to change the town because of what would happen in the next 5 minutes of game time. It's just the dissonance is hard to ignore nowadays. Anyway, one strange occurrence later, and we enter the Temple of Time. Using the 3 stones and the song you just learned, you'll open the doors of time, and there it is. The Master Sword. You go to pull it from the pedestal, and in a sequence that still feels just right, Link obtains the legendary blade. Only, instead of just continuing on your quest, Link gets teleported to the Chamber of the Sages and meets Rauru. Yes, Rauru, not to be confused with Rauru. Although I am sure there is some kind of connection here. What it is, I don't know, I can't tell you. But Rauru does lay on some more plot and reveals that it's been 7 years since you drew the sword. Link has a more grown-up body, being somewhere around the age of, 17, maybe 18 if you want to stretch it. This poor kid, by the way. Still, 10 years old mentally, but in a body that certainly must feel super awkward to be in. Imagine growing 10 years in what feels like an instant. I remember my teenage years. It was awkward just one day at a time. Forget speed running that. Link was too young to properly use the sword, so the Sacred Realm just kinda held on to him until he was able enough to use it to the fullest. Alright, so let's detour real quick. This whole sequence is really pivotal to the whole growing up aspect of this narrative, or at least I've interpreted it that way. To me, now, as an adult, this is less of a heroic feat for Link and more sort of an inciting incident for his character. Don't get me wrong, this scene is still very cool, and as far as a heroic journey is considered, it hits all of the marks, but it's wrong. For me, growing up was not as straightforward as it might have been for many others. Much like Link here, I had my childhood more or less stripped away from me, albeit it wasn't nearly as cool as drawing a magical blade. That said, it wasn't insidious either. More, it was just the consequences of my parents' life choices and how it affected myself, whether they knew it or not. I was forced to grow up too quickly. Due to circumstances beyond my control, I became a de facto parent, I suppose, to my younger brother. And a lot was placed on my shoulders that I just wasn't prepared for as a kid. I was still just too young, but I was given these responsibilities almost out of necessity. Maybe some of you out there can relate to this. For all of us, there is a point in time where we're just forced to grow up. Sometimes it shows up exactly when it was required. Some may still be in that process now, but for others like Link, like myself, and maybe even you, that growth happened way too early. I remember hearing all the time how mature I was for my age, and, all the garbage that came with that. And it can cause some issues. Now, don't get me wrong, I still did some kid stuff. I was still a child, but in the back of my mind, I had a voice telling me to do the, quote, adult thing. And if I did do something that was wrong, even if it was something that a normal kid might do because they just didn't know any better, the punishments were often kind of severe, because I should have known better. All too quickly, however, due to reasons I'm still, working out, I was forced to be something that I just wasn't ready to be, just like Link. I identified with this version of Link as a kid because it felt like we were going through similar events. Granted, my circumstances were definitely more, domestic than Link trying to save the land in 2 timelines, but that's not the point. To a kid facing down adulthood or even adult responsibilities can feel like a whirlwind adventure that you're just underprepared for. You have to learn as you go and hope that you don't mess up too bad along the way. You can say at the end of all of this that Link gets his childhood back because of what Zelda does, but does he really? I'll close out my thoughts on this when we get there, but hold on to that. Hold on to that question. Those thoughts. I'll explain my reasoning. This Link will be forever changed by what his adventure has in store for him. So let's continue. Tasked with yet more adventuring, you exit the realm and encounter Sheik. Seemingly the last of the Sheikah, they give more information about the world since your disappearance and point you in the direction of your first trial. Leaving this temple, immediately you can tell that the world is just bad. The color is gone, Death Mountain looms in the background, and the castle town is no more. In fact, it's been taken over by Redeads. A full-on zombie apocalypse happened while you were gone. Yeah, Ganondorf just took over. He entered right after you opened the doors of time and seized control of the Triforce, or at least a part of it. Now this reveal is what I wanted as a kid, though to be honest, this might have been just a bit much. Castletown was destroyed and people scattered to the winds just trying to survive. It's what I like to call all bad. Time to start to fix the damage. Starting with the forest. Yeah, back to the Kokiri Woods, and more specifically, the Lost Woods. If you remembered the way to find Saria back when you were looking to get Darunia to, feel again, you already know the way. You'll even encounter Mido again, who, as per usual, is blocking you. One song later, and you'll enter the Forest Temple. Sheik shows up and teaches you a song to teleport here if you need a quick way back for any reason. Definitely not me for getting the hook shot or anything. The temple is yet another example of steadily rising difficulty. By this point, though, you should have a fairly solid handle on how these things work, so they aren't afraid to kick it up a notch in terms of the layout. You'll get the bow here and face off against Phantom Ganon. This is a great way to introduce how Ganondorf fights. It foreshadows the future really well. As a kid, I was none the wiser. I was just kind of happily playing along and enjoying the experience. It was really eye-opening for me, though, when I went back to face Ganondorf proper. But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit here. Saria gets revealed to be the Sage of the Forest. Who could have seen that coming? I didn't back then, but, it made sense to me. It would also plant the idea that the key characters in this story are people that you have already met as a child. Just about every named NPC is important, some more than others, which would also mean, if you were paying attention, then you know that the next stop for you would be Death Mountain and the Gorons. In a way, this is great because it doesn't force a bunch of downtime and trying to figure out where to go next, but at the same time, it kind of takes away from the player just, finding the right places to be. It's a nice middle ground for a kid to handle, as you still feel like you're getting to go places on your own terms, but really it's kind of like a guided experience. Linear is the best way to describe it. Not a bad thing, just not really what Zelda had been up to this point, you know? The Fire Temple requires some new duds and another new song from Sheik. Darunia went in ahead of you to try and deal with this on his own, but, well, one conversation later and a bunch of freed Gorons, it would reveal that Volvagia did him in. Volvagia is a dragon that eats Gorons exclusively. So for Darunia to enter alone, he likely knew he wouldn't make it out, especially since he never found the Goron's hammer. But you did, and once you do, it's time to face Volvagia. When you enter, you find the chamber empty. One Volvagia fight later, and Darunia reappears as the Sage of Fire. Slowly but surely you're undoing the damage that was dealt to Hyrule. Death Mountain looks normal-ish again, and you're off to the next area, the Zora domain. It's been frozen over though, which means there really isn't a quick way in here anymore. The best you can do is the secret entrance from the Lost Woods, but that's about it. Thankfully, even though the king is frozen, you can still slip past him. Going to the Jabu Jabu area, you see that the giant fish is just gone, but you can slip and slide your way into the ice cavern now. Nothing is really added in here. It's kind of just like a bonus area for you to collect a few things, namely blue fire in a bottle and the iron boots. Oh, and the warp song to take you to Lake Hylia, so I guess it was kind of important. I would recommend taking your time, though. Don't just warp straight there. If you defrost the king, he'll give you some new clothing, and it allows you to exist in deep water without needing to breathe. Neat. Now, at this point, you should have your faithful steed, Epona, and if not, you should maybe consider doing that. You'll need her help to travel the fields quickly. In fact, now might be a good time to do some side questing in general. At this point, a whole bunch have opened up, Kakariko Village having more than a few, many of which are very much required to make additional progress. I won't go over them all, as there are just way too many, and this video is looking like it's going to be pretty long as it is, but this game has been out for a hot minute now. Take some time, look up a nice solid walkthrough, and you'll manage just fine. The most important ones, side quest wise, of course, being the Lens of Truth and that well. That damn well. I got stuck here as a kid. I got super frustrated, not knowing what was a false wall and what was real. The floor would give out, the fact that some monsters were just invisible, the Redeads, the Gibdos. This place was a nightmare, and you already know that Dead Hand was something that just haunted me as a kid, and maybe even you. Little did I know what this would be the opening act of. I also spent a bunch of time collecting those gold Skulltulas. I would recommend you do the same. They're required for larger wallets, and if you want to get certain things, you're going to need that purchasing power. Some others of note are the shooting ranges and the bomb bowling.
Bomb bowling. Bomb bowling. Bomb bowling. Bomb bowling. It added bomb bowling. It added bomb bowling.
Though that's with, bomb shoes, and they aren't really needed for completion, they just, make missed shots or bomb tosses that much less punishing. And that isn't even all of them. There are so many little secrets tucked away in all the corners of this place. Take some time and just kind of explore around. It'll be worth it, I promise. Did you enjoy that break? I hope so, because the Water Temple is next, and that's commonly referred to as the most difficult, or at least the most tedious. That said, I never really understood the hate that this place gets. Even as a kid, I was able to navigate this temple fairly easily. Did I still get a bit turned around? Sure. I'm not perfect, but the water raising and lowering was never really an issue in my eyes. It was certainly tedious, though. All that back and forth trying to find those handful of rooms that you missed. Like I said at the start, though, I was taking my time, really looking around and getting a feeling for how the game logic works here. And because I have played other puzzle-centric games, some maybe more difficult than this was, I was able to navigate this area easily enough. I still am. This temple didn't take me much longer than the others, and it's been well over 13 years since the last time I played any version of this. Anyway, you'll meet Princess Ruto here, and she just disappears, kind of like Darunia did. Strange. Interestingly, there's a mini-boss here. And this never really pops up in any other dungeon, except maybe the Spirit Temple, if you want to count Iron Knuckles as a mini-boss. This arena is cool. It looks like an endless expanse with a single sandbar with a tree. Your reflection in the water, gone as you make your way past it. Going to the door, only to find it barred off. Turning around, and there you are, Dark Link. Now, you could do what some people do and just slam away with the hammer, but that's lame, man. Fight this guy. You didn't know, your own attacks with the sword are dependent on if you're holding a direction with the stick. So holding forward will cause Link to do a thrust attack. If you do this against Dark Link, though, you're gonna get styled on. Straight up just stands on your sword and sometimes will even counter you. Holding nothing and swinging does a vertical swing, and holding a direction that isn't forward causes a horizontal swing. So, go to town. This fight is cool, just like it was back in Zelda 2, only this time it's a bit more, fair, maybe. Now, I don't blame you if you decide to hammer cheese this, it's a crazy tough fight, but remember that you have so many options to fight with because of all the items you found. Try something new and try to have fun with it. One mini-boss down, and a long shot later, you get to face the real boss. Not much of a fight here. In fact, it's way less impressive than Dark Link was. It's more time-consuming than anything. Ruto will appear as the Sage of Water, and another medallion gets added to the collection. Only a few more to go. Speaking with Sheik again atop the temple, you don't really learn anything except that Link is not very observant, and Sheik might just straight up be Batman?
Then I guess we're up and... He does that a lot. And I'm talking to myself.
So, at this point, Link has revisited just about everywhere he did as a kid. What now? Navi suggested heading to a place that might have people to talk with. Assuming you were noticing, there really isn't anywhere to speak with people, unless you wanted to speak with the Kokiri kids, but something tells me they're not exactly in the know. So, off to Kakariko. Here we see Sheik, and, well, something happens. Something takes both Link and Sheik for a ride, and here starts the Shadow Temple. Sheik will give you the warp song so you can come and go, but it's time to take a trip to parts unknown. Thematically speaking, the Shadow Temple is one of the darkest in nearly all of Zelda, and I'm not talking about the lighting. The lore more or less states that this location was where the Sheikah would take enemies to the crown and interrogate them, and nothing else. Don't mind the blood on the floor, or the giant scythes, nor the flare stations you'll encounter in some rooms. Yeah, this place is kind of messed up. This temple was built on the literal bones of Hyrule's enemies, and even some who were loyal to the crown. Okay, so from a lore perspective, this is great world building because it implies that even this kingdom is not infallible. You are saving a kingdom that has committed travesties much along the same lines as Ganondorf has, with the exception that Ganondorf has really made life everywhere else in the kingdom almost impossible. Whereas the royal family had, at least, some sense of duty to its people. Theming aside, this temple is more or less built around the lens of truth. So get to lensing? Truthing? I'm a truth seeker. I don't know, this temple is very straightforward, and even with its true sight mechanics, way less frustrating than the water temple. Bongo Bongo is a fun boss fight and further showcases the lengths that the royals went to silence its detractors. Impa gets revealed to be the Sage of the Shadows, because of course it was going to be her, and another medallion gets added. So 5 of 6 gathered, and really only one spot remains. It's time to check out the desert and the Gerudo. We haven't really been here at all. It's been blocked off basically the entire time. All that we know is that the Gerudo are an all-female society. They leave their home in the desert to find mates, and once every 100 years or so, a single male is born, and for some reason, they get named king. And that's where Ganondorf comes into the picture. He's that guy. It's strange to me that Ganondorf is depicted as Gerudo in just about every instance were there a thing? I mean, why them? Why not Hylian? Or any other race that exists in the world? All I'm saying is that the Shadow Temple lays down some good groundwork for where the evil can come from, either within the royal court or, really anywhere within the landscape of Hyrule. It doesn't exclusively have to be the Gerudo, I don't know. Food for thought, I suppose. At any rate, the search for answer leads Link to the Gerudo Fortress, and as an added bonus, you get to engage in more stealth segments. Getting caught here causes Link to get literally thrown into a space with only one exit. For some reason, they don't take your equipment though, so getting out is just as easy as getting in is. Finding the carpenters is fairly straightforward. Just make sure when you fight the guards you don't get hit at all otherwise. Freeing all four grants you a free pass into the fort with no consequences, so, that's nice. They also provide info on where to head to next. This desert segment is easy enough, and eventually you'll get to the temple. This one is fun, because it requires you to visit it in 2 timelines, as a kid and as an adult. I always liked the idea of this place. It was super cool. Back then, I thought this idea of time traveling back and forth to solve the dungeon had so many possibilities. But really, now, as I finish it out, it's not all that great. You only go back once and then solve the rest as an adult. It's kinda a missed opportunity, really. Having it broken into 2 parts is nice, but it just isn't enough, really? I'm not sure how they could further expand on this idea, but I know that they can. One thing does happen, and it continues the trend of having met the sages as a child first, before seeing what happens to them. That said, the fate of Naburo here... Naburo? That said, the fate of Naburo here is not really left to question. She gets abducted by Kotake and Koume. Link just kinda shrugs that off and comes back as an adult. Finishing out the rest of the dungeon, we round out the rest of Link's equipment. We find another Iron Knuckle, and what a fight these guys are. So much better than 99% of the other combat encounters. Still, the fact that you have to fight one as a kid is wild. This one, though, is a bit different. Defeating it, we see it's Naburo, who, once again, gets taken away. Wrapping up the temple, we face the Witch Sisters, and with some clever mirror shield use, we see them fuse into Twin Rova. Not exactly sure what causes them to de-age so dramatically, but okay, sure. Once you beat them, they get halos? We sure about that? They bicker, and I think this is kind of a tired trope at this point, But anyway, you get the last medallion, and she really lays it on thick here. Jesus, what? Link is 10 when she met him first. What was she planning on doing? With all 6 medallions, you can head back to the Temple of Time and start the end game. Before that, though, now is the time to wrap up any side quests you may want to run, if only to get the big Goron sword. Why? Well, if you don't know, you will soon enough, I suppose. Do take some time, though. Really, hunting down all 32 pieces of heart can be a bit rough. There is still one last upgrade to get, but it requires something kinda dumb. Once you feel like you're ready, it's time. Getting to the temple, we encounter Sheik, who turns out to be Zelda? Oh my god! As a kid who was working this out, it came out as a decent surprise. Looking back on this with adult eyes, you can see this coming. Not only does the game just kind of hint at this if you bother to read the dialogue, but once again, the game introduces all the sages to you as a kid, so clearly Zelda was going to be Sheik. Now, at this point you might be asking, what about Rauru? You didn't meet him as a kid, so you're wrong about this. What if, dear viewer, what if I told you that you did meet him? Do you remember that owl? Yeah, that's Rauru. Guess what? You met him as a kid. He even has the owl eyebrow thing. So, yeah, all 7 sages met as a child. Crazy, huh? Anyway, that small revelation aside, through the power of plot, Ganondorf somehow traps Zelda. This doesn't really make any sense. If he can remotely trap people like this, why not do this at any point? He knew we were running around doing things to thwart his plans, and it can't be because of the Triforce powers, because Zelda also has a segment of it, and she still got caught. As a kid, this was like just all power fantasy, right? Naturally, it has to come to this, a fight between both good and evil. A child rising to the call to action. It's everything you want in a story like this. Now though, I don't know, man, it seems kind of cliche, don't you think? So, through the power of a rainbow bridge and the sages, we can enter the castle. This final gauntlet is like a mashup of all the things that you did to get to this point, and it acts as a way to finalize all of your hard work. Speaking of, for some reason, the game gives you another gauntlet upgrade. This seems like it's a bit much, maybe lazy even. Those silver hands were one of the last upgrades from the last dungeon proper, so why make them useless immediately after? I don't know, it's strange. Stranger still, if you leave the castle and go here, you can find the final upgrade, which makes it so you take half damage from everything. Gaining access to the final ascent, we hear some organ playing. The standoff for the fate of Hyrule starts. Navi becomes almost useless between the light ping pong match and light arrows. Ganondorf falls. One escape sequence with Zelda later, and the castle topples on top of Ganondorf. Quest over. Except, no, it's not. From the rubble, Ganondorf appears, Triforce glowing, and a transformation begins. Now this is what I remember as a kid. A giant pig monster man, Ganon, has arrived, smacking the Master Sword out of Link's hand and placing up a wall of flame. It's now man versus monster. I love the backdrop to this fight, a crumbled castle serving as the arena, lightning flashing in the background, always behind Ganon, so you only really see bits and pieces of the monster you're facing. The set dressing is fantastic. As a kid, I knew this was something special. As an adult, I still think that. This is something that really only Twilight Princess can compete with. Even some of the newer Zelda titles have trouble in this regard. I hope you grab that big Goron sword, otherwise you're gonna have to hammer it out here. Once you get enough damage on him though, you can reclaim the Master Sword again, and with a bit of help from Zelda, you'll land that finishing blow. that's it. The game is over. Now it's just about the epilogue. This is both the best and worst thing that Zelda had ever done for Link. For Hyrule, even. Zelda, whether she knew it or not, caused a division in time. Sending Link back so he could have a childhood left her time without a hero. To make matters worse, Navi just straight up bails on Link, really one of the only friends he had through this whole endeavor. Link ends up meeting with Zelda here in the past and gets Ganondorf taken care of before anything really kicks off, closing out this game and its tale. This game, for better or worse, has set a standard that almost every Zelda game after has been compared to. Now, this is a problem in two parts, the biggest being the player feedback, and you can't lie to me. I was around and active in this time period. The internet was starting to really take off and forums started popping up everywhere. After Ocarina of Time was released and Majora's Mask had left its mark, people were wondering what the next Zelda would look like. After a visual feast that popped up showcasing Link and Ganon engaging in one-on-one combat, it looked great for its time. People were super stoked for it. It looked like Ocarina of Time, just better. So when Wind Waker came out, people were less than thrilled. And again, you can't lie. I know a large population of the fanbase were very much upset by this new art style. I won't lie, I was also caught off guard by it. Now, much like most other players, it grew on me, but the collective disappointment made the series take a hard backstep into looking more realistic. This is on us. While people got used to the Wind Waker style, the damage had basically been done, and Twilight Princess would double down on what a Zelda title is. Wind Waker, outside of its style, was still using the foundation that Ocarina of Time laid out. It was a bit different, but the formula was really starting to set in, and this is the other fault of Ocarina of Time. It stagnated the series. It's partly why the games that came out after Ocarina didn't take very many risks. The formula worked, and it worked too well, and we just ate it up. And why not? The games are still fun. Clearly, they're still being made. But as I said earlier, it kind of gets stale after a while. Ocarina might just be the best in the sense that it is the base for almost every other game that came out after this one. Even from companies that have nothing to do with Nintendo, it would set the standard. And with that, our collective perception of what a Zelda should and needs to be. To round out the story, Link, or rather the hero of time, in my opinion, gets a raw deal. He doesn't get reset at the end of all of this. Sure, he gets sent back in time, but he still remembers everything. In this new timeline, he won't get to be anything special, just another Hylian child. This timeline won't really know who he is, what he accomplished. Without Navi, he can't really head back to the Kokiri either. He'd get lost in the woods, and more than likely, too young to enter the ranks of the Hylian Knights, and even if he did right now, it wouldn't serve his wants. Eventually, he sets out to try and locate Navi. While we never really find out whether he did or not, we do know that eventually he did return to Hyrule, he did become a knight, and at some point he died in the woods and became a Stalfos. As is the fate of any who die and or go missing in the woods. Now, you might be thinking, surely the people of the future he saved will hold the hero in high regard, and you'd be right. For a long while, they sure did. His story became legend, one that was passed down to children who reached the age of the hero at the start of his journey. That, however, also faded over time, and when Ganon resurfaced with no hero to call upon, the land fell into darkness. Things got so bad that the legend of the hero of time became myth to its people, and even something that some kind of resented, or rather didn't fully understand anymore. Talk about a brutal fate. You either live and become nothing more than your average knight, knowing full well what you did to save the land, or your tale falls into obscurity and is even hated by the descendants of those that you saved. It must have been a really lonely existence for Link. But that's part of growing up, isn't it? You reach out and meet so many people, do so much as a child, but it slowly begins to fade away with time. The people you used to hang out with slowly fall off, your life becomes less of an adventure. No longer are things new to you. You learn and you experience things, sure, either on your own or secondhand. Life becomes more of a predictable thing. Schedules and time become our life. It's why we look back to nostalgic things so fondly. It reminds us of simpler times when life was an adventure. Most things in life shape you into who you are, and you carry that weight. This is why I, as an adult, relate and identify with Link. He goes through some things, and to the eyes of a child, it can all be read metaphorically. Overcoming adversity, reaching out, and having the courage to face down the unknown. Like a dungeon, life can seem tough to deal with until you have the right equipment or information to overcome what it is that you're facing. Once you have that experience, however, there's no going back. It doesn't matter that Zelda sent Link back in time. He will never have the childhood that she thought he could. He has experienced too much, grown up too quickly, and it forever marks him. You can say that Zelda sending back Link was the worst outcome possible for him. He will get those 7 missing years back, sure, but it comes at the price of having experienced horrors that you can never unsee or unexperience. All that said, growing up doesn't need to be all doom and gloom. Thankfully, unlike Link here, there's a solid chance that you have people in your life. People who, if you play your cards right, will stick with you as you grow up. Just be careful. That circle can get smaller if you let it. Growing up with this game didn't magically make everything better for me, but because I was at the right age and this game came out at the right time, it gave me tools. These tools are what made me look at games more carefully than I had previously. It wasn't about playing a game anymore. Now it was about asking questions. It was about learning and taking the time to experience what I can. It was about growing up. Oh my god, I didn't even talk about the timeline! Hey there, friends. Thanks for sticking with this video. I know it's a touch different from everything else I've made thus far. Although, I don't know, maybe it's more similar than I think. At any rate, now you know a little bit more about me, so hey, that's something. If you made it in this deep, let me know if there was a game like this for you when you were a kid. I have a handful of others that have impacted me in some pretty big ways, and if you want to hear those stories, and you guess you're just gonna have to stick around. It'll happen eventually. In the meantime, thanks for hanging out with me. Stay cool, and keep it clean, yeah?